Okay, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to wave to our technicians in the back room to start the webcasting because we have a good, excellent, hello, welcome everyone to the Friday Transportation Seminar here at Portland State University. My name is Jennifer Dill. I'm faculty in the School of Urban Studies and Planning, and along with my colleagues, Miguel Figliozzi in Civil Engineering, John Glebe, also in Urban Studies and Planning, we help co-organize this weekly seminar. For those of you who are new to the seminar, the reason I have this microphone here is that we webcast the seminars. So people are watching live on the web. We also archive all the seminars. If you haven't seen our website, we have several years of seminars archived. It's a great resource. But the other thing that affects you in terms of the webcast is that once we get to the question and answer at the end of the talk, you do need to use the microphone so the people watching on the web can hear your question. On a lot of the tables, there is a microphone glued to the table. There's a touch button. Hold that. Keep the red light lit as you are asking your question. If for some reason there is no microphone or it's not working, one of us will come around with this portable mic. And if you start to ask a question without using a mic, we're going to interrupt you and nag you to use the mic. So try to remember once we get to that point. So without further ado, I'm really happy to have with us actually a repeat performer in our Transportation Summit. So you can go back, look at the archive, and see a previous presentation that Joe Cortright came and gave at this seminar a couple years ago. Today, Joe Cortright is a principal at Impresa Consulting. He's today going to be talking about some work. He's been working a lot with the organization CEOs for Cities. He's going to be presenting some of his work today about Driven Apart, looking at some measures of congestion and mobility. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Joe.
Thanks, Jennifer, and it's a pleasure to be back here and to have an opportunity to talk at the Transportation Seminar. And what I'm going to be talking about today is a study that we did in collaboration with CEOs for Cities and sponsored by Rockefeller Foundation that looked at how we go about measuring urban transportation performance in the United States. And just by way of reference, all of this material is available on the web at the CEOs for Cities .org website. So don't worry about scribbling down notes. I have a few copies of the hardbound version of the report. You can download that on the web. And the report really comes in two flavors. One is this very nicely produced and shortly edited, tightly edited document for general consumption. And then we have about a 60-page academic paper that we've written called Measuring Urban Transportation Performance that explores in great detail and fleshes out all of the summary and conclusions that are presented in the glossy report. And what I'm going to do is I'll be talking about sort of what has become the dominant paradigm in urban transportation system measurement, almost by default, and that's the Urban Mobility Report that's produced roughly annually by the Texas Transportation Institute. And what I'm going to suggest to you is that the approach that has been used in the past fundamentally mismeasures the performance of urban transportation systems, presents a very distorted view of what the problem is and what the potential solutions are, and gives us really misleading advice and a misleading frame for thinking about urban transportation. And what we've tried to do in Driven Apart is lay out the case for why that's a problem and to suggest the direction that we need to move in terms of crafting alternatives so that we have real metrics that will help us understand how our urban transportation systems are performing, how policies can influence their performance, and what we can do to make them better over time. And our hope is, and we don't think in Driven Apart that we've reached a final conclusion about what the optimal way is to measure urban transportation systems, but we're convinced that there needs to be a broader set of measures and a national dialogue and an informed academic discussion by a broadly representative community if we're going to have a set of measures that are useful to us rather than misleading. So that's a quick synopsis of the presentation. Our key finding and our key argument in Driven Apart is that the secret to reducing the amount of time that Americans spend in peak hour travel has much more to do with how we build our communities, how they are laid out, the pattern of land uses, and the set of transportation choices available, than it does about the capacity of the road system. And that is essentially exactly the opposite of the conclusion that one would reach if you read the Urban Mobility Report. In short, it's distance that matters and the length of trips that Americans are taking at the peak hour. On average, the typical American in the United States travels about 200 hours per year during the peak period. That's roughly speaking 6 to 10 in the morning, 4 to 7 in the afternoon. But in the best performing cities, in a whole and I'll focus on the 50 large metropolitan areas in the United States that have a population of 1 million or more. In the best performing metropolitan areas, the typical traveler spends about 20% less time than that. They spend about 40 fewer hours per year in peak hour traffic. And the reason that they do has everything to do with the land use patterns in those cities, and they end up traveling shorter distances. Now here is this array, and I'll be referring to this group of large metropolitan areas, and I appreciate this may be a little bit difficult to read at distance, but this is an array of all of the 50 largest US metropolitan areas. And what we've done here is compute the total amount of time that the average traveler spends commuting in the peak hours on an annual basis. And these data, I should add, are constructed from the same underlying data set that are used in the Urban Mobility Report. So you can see at the top, Nashville, Oklahoma City, Birmingham, Richmond, Virginia, and Raleigh, Durham, North Carolina have the longest peak hour commutes in the United States. And the shortest are in cities like Chicago, New Orleans, Milwaukee, Sacramento, Cleveland. By the way, Portland is close to the bottom, not at the bottom, in terms of the total amount of time that people spend commuting during the peak hour. And so that's the big variable is there's a lot of variation in how long people spend. Now, what we've essentially done here is made an estimate of how much longer people end up traveling in some metropolitan areas because their commutes are longer than the 90th percentile, or the 10th percentile shortest commute in the country. So the shortest commute is about 140 hours per year. Those adjusted for travel speeds, those dark bars correspond to how much more time people spend traveling simply because in their metropolitan area, their average trip length is longer in physical distance than in the average area. So you can see the big variable here that explains the variation in travel times across metropolitan areas is the differences in trip length. And that has, again, everything to do with land use patterns. Now, I'm going to show you some numbers from our ranking and then from the Urban Mobility Report ranking. So, and again, these are taken directly from this table. So if you look at the top of that table, top 4 cities, Nashville, Oklahoma City, Birmingham, Richmond. And they rank the 4 highest. They have the 4 longest commutes as measured by total travel time. According to the Urban Mobility Report, all of those metropolitan areas perform better than average in the United States. They're 30th through 44th. And the cities that we found had some of the shortest commutes, New York, Sacramento, Chicago, the Urban Mobility Report said had the worst congestion problems. So obviously there's a real difference of opinion about what the nature of the problems are. The reason is, and I'll explain in a minute, is the Urban Mobility Report focuses simply on how fast you can travel. It does not consider how far you have to travel. So the reason that they rank some cities differently than we do is because the average travel speeds are essentially slower. Even though in the cities that we point out, the ones at the top of the list, spend many, many more hours traveling as a result. So that's sort of a quick introduction to the thesis of our work and the key difference between our work and the Urban Mobility Report. I'll develop these 5 points in turn. First, I'm going to talk about the Urban Mobility Report, tell you a little bit more about it, the role it plays in discussions of transportation policy, why we think the core measure used in that report, something called the Travel Time Index, is a misleading and flawed measure of transportation systems. I'll talk about how they overestimate congestion, and then I'll talk about their fuel economy estimates, and then talk about how we go about developing better measures. And I'll also mention that, as you probably saw, this report was released in September of last year. 2 weeks ago, the Texas Transportation Institute released its latest urban mobility report, the one that's dated 2010, that includes data essentially for 2009. We've had a quick chance to review it, and where I can, I'll make references to the later version. But our written report and all of our material are based on the previous printed version of the report. The short story there is they've made a couple of changes, but in our view, they haven't fixed the fundamental problems we've identified. So this is the previous report, the UMR for 2009. It's been produced since about 1982 on almost an annual basis. It makes some big claims about traffic and traffic congestion. It says it's a big problem. It costs the average person 46 hours of delay per year. It wastes a lot of energy. It's getting worse. I mean, that's the meme here, is that it's much, much worse than it was a decade ago or 2 decades ago. And they argued that in the previous version of the report that it cost us each of us $750 a year, up from a little less than $300 in 1982. The new version of the report changes that. Interestingly, they're now saying that congestion costs us 12 hours less per year than they said in the previous edition of the report. Now, just as an aside here, that ought to be a headline finding. We reduced congestion in the United States by more than a quarter, according to just a comparison of the last 2 reports. They don't talk anything about that change at all. The headline finding is still congestion is getting worse. They're still maintaining it wastes a lot of energy. They're still saying it's gotten worse over time, and they've upped their dollar estimate of the cost of congestion. So between this report and the last report, you can see now that each additional hour of delay is valued more highly, and there's some technical reasons for that. But they're basically saying it's at least double the problem that it was in the early 1980s. So that's the synopsis of the report. And the theme here in the report is, the subtext of the urban mobility report is, this is an awful problem and you ought to throw more money at capacity. And in the text of the report, they don't say that explicitly, but that's clearly the way this report is used. As they say, it's everybody's second slide in a PowerPoint presentation. Here's a transportation problem. It's really horrible. It affects our economy. The TTI says it costs all this money. And as Lomax said in his quote to the Washington Post, you need to build more capacity in growing areas. And then he says all these other things that you might do might help a little, but in the end, there's a need for capacity. And that's how this report is used, as a justification for augmenting capacity. And it's interesting because one of the comments that Tim Lomax, the author of the UMR, made when we released our report was that CEOs for Cities is a group of advocates, and that our position is driven by advocacy. I hope I'll show you the evidence behind our conclusions. You can decide whether we're advocates. But it's very clear that this report, in my mind, is not about scholarship. It's not about independent, objective advice. It's about beating the drum for more capacity. And it shows up in a very straightforward way in the press. This was the Wall Street Journal earlier this week. Very catchy headline. In fact, this is a good example of all the press coverage that you get. You get a couple of photos of traffic jams, and then you get, how much is 70 hours a year? It's longer than Lindbergh spent crossing the Atlantic, and so on. So it's a story that is a sort of, it's a report that translates in a very direct way into a story that is uncritically repeated in newspapers across the country, which in our view is unfortunate, because this report, in our view, really ignores reality. As I pointed out, we think the critical issue here is how far people end up traveling in the peak hour. That's the big determinant of peak time. The way their index is structured is it essentially punishes places that are compact and have less sprawl, and essentially it rewards places that are very sprawling, again, because it's based on how fast you travel, not how far you have to travel. The underlying measure of this travel time index is based on the assumption that you could completely eliminate all congestion, that you should be able to travel just as fast at the peak hour as you might travel at 2 in the morning. And that's, in our view, an unrealistic baseline. It's not achievable in the real world. We think the model that they've used in the past for computing speeds and computing the index is flawed, and we think there's some serious problems with their fuel economy estimates. I'll go through each of those in turn. let me start with the core of this proposal, or this research, which is something called the travel time index. And this underlies all of their estimates of how bad congestion is in different metropolitan areas. So to compute a travel time index, you essentially look at how long it takes to take a particular journey on a particular road segment when there is no congestion. And let's say a trip takes 20 minutes in the off-peak hours. And then figure out how long it takes to take that same trip during the peak hour. And say, again, this trip takes, however, again, same segment, takes 5 minutes longer. It takes 25 minutes. So in that case, the travel time index is 25 divided by 20, or 1.25. And that's how that index is calculated. And it's the equivalent of 5 minutes of delay. Now, in some respects, that would be a fair measure of congestion if the trip length in every single metropolitan area were the same, or if everyone traveled exactly the average. But again, as we pointed out, there are huge variations in trip lengths across cities. So the effect of that index is really to penalize compact cities. First, it's an unrealistic baseline. I'll elaborate on that. And then second, when you compare actual cases, this travel time index clearly presents a distorted view of who bears the greater burden of urban transportation. So in the last report, the Texas Transportation Institute said the TTI, the travel time index in Chicago, was 1.43. It took about 43% longer to take a peak hour trip than it would take in the same trip would take in the off-peak hour, as opposed to Charlotte, where the peak hour trip would only take about 25% longer. But when you look at trips in those two cities, the average resident of Charlotte ends up traveling about 50% further than the average resident in Chicago, because it's a much more sprawling place, doesn't have compact development. And as a result, that average Charlotte resident ends up spending about 38 minutes a day in commuting in peak hours, compared to about 15 minutes less than that for the average Chicago resident. So even though both of those commuters face the same amount of delay, the trip takes about 10 minutes longer than it would in the off-peak hours in both Chicago and Charlotte on average. This report and this methodology say the problem is much, much worse in Chicago, even though those Chicago commuters on average are spending 15 minutes less each day in peak hour traffic. Now, we also think that the Urban Mobility Report has, particularly in the past, dramatically overestimated the amount of congestion and the amount of delays. If you think about that travel time index, it's really predicated on knowing how fast traffic moves at the peak hour as opposed to the off-peak hour. And in point of fact, they don't have data on that, or have not had data on that in the past. And what they've done is built a statistical model that allows them to take volume data, the number of cars that are traveling on a road, and estimate the speed with which that traffic is moving. So this is not direct observations of speed. It's inferences about speed based on volume. So they say if there's so many cars moving down a road, on average, they must be moving at this speed. The trouble is the model they've used in the past is flawed, and their results don't square with other measures. Now, here's some data for you. This is the data on the relationship between volume, daily traffic per lane, and speeds. These are actual observations from traffic recorders. This is how they calibrated that model that allowed them to translate volume into speed. The dots represent the data. First of all, not a really great fit. You know, the R-square here is not really high. If you fit an R-square, or if you fit a simple linear regression to that model, you get a line that looks about like that one right there up at the top. The model that they used in the Urban Mobility Report is down here. It basically is below about 85, almost 90% of the observations. So right there, that's telling you that is not an unbiased statistical estimate of the relationship between volume and speed. In fact, their model greatly overestimates the effect of additional volume in terms of reducing speed. It overestimates it in our estimation, in our analysis, by about 80%. So that's up until the very latest version, the one that came out 2 weeks ago. The Urban Mobility Report generated all of its estimates of traffic and traffic delays using this model, which is flawed. And this model continues to be the base for their historical estimates. That is, they don't have any real-time traffic estimates from before about 2007. In the latest version of the report, they have now shifted to use real-time traffic data that's generated by a company called INRIX out of Seattle that collects data from commercial fleets that have GPS systems, data plans, and so on. They monitor about 2 million vehicles. We think it's actually pretty good data. So the latest version of the report will going forward, I think, help correct that problem. But when we check the validity of the estimates in the urban mobility report, we think that they don't square with the other data that's out there, including this data from INRIX, and I'll talk about that in just a second. But one of the things that we asked was, and again, a core finding of the urban mobility report is traffic congestion has gotten dramatically worse since 1982, and it's wasting about 2 to 3 times as much time and adding that to the length of commutes. Now, if that were true, we would expect to find that average commuting trips in the United States, controlling for distance, would take longer in 2001 than they did in 1982. And so what we did is look at the National Household Travel Survey that's done by the Department of Transportation, random selection of US households, and look to see whether or not the data reported by households about their travel patterns matched the trend that was estimated by the urban mobility report. The UMR estimate, if you take the difference between 1982 and 2001, which happened to be 2 years that survey was done, said that on average, the typical commute trip increased by about 2.3 minutes per day. So 2 minutes, 20 seconds, something like that. That's the implication of the urban mobility report. That's how they get their big increase in the number of hours of congestion and the big cost of it. But in fact, when you look at the National Household Travel Survey, and after you adjust for the change in trip distances, that is, people drove further in 2001 than they did in 1982, people actually spent less time commuting after you controlled for that change in travel distances. So the change in travel times that the average American experienced in their commuting between 1982 and 1991 had nothing to do with driving slower and actually had everything to do with driving longer distances, which is not the implication of the urban mobility report. Now, one of the things that we did is we took the point estimates of that travel time index from the urban mobility report and compared them to similar estimates made by INRIX, this company that generates the real-time data. And these are those 2 estimates, one prepared by INRIX, one prepared by urban mobility report based on their old model of that same variable, the travel time index in 2008. And in every case but 2, effectively, all of the estimates made by the urban mobility report were that the travel time index was higher than those from the INRIX data. And on average, they were about 70% higher than the INRIX data. Now, one of the big questions that's not answered in the methodology of the new report is how they've reconciled these 2 numbers, because now they're saying the INRIX numbers are much closer to theirs. But the numbers generated by INRIX before they started providing data to the urban mobility report are very different. And again, the urban mobility report and its model-based system produced much higher values of the travel time index. Next thing I want to talk about is fuel consumption estimates. One of the key arguments about the economic and energy impact of congestion is that it wastes a lot of fuel. And if you read the urban mobility report carefully, you'll find that their estimates of how much more fuel automobiles consume because of congestion is based on a study done by the Department of Transportation in 1981. So now that's a 30-year-old study. It was based on 1976 and earlier, older General Motors cars that averaged about 14 miles per gallon. And the other thing is, in that study, which with the help of the library here at Portland State University, we found on microfiche, it wasn't available anywhere on the web, that the study itself said the relationship, and by the way, they did this on a handheld TI calculator. This is very, very old stuff. They said that the relationship that they observed between speed and fuel economy only held for speeds up to 35 miles an hour. So they essentially are looking at in-city traffic. And of course, what the Urban Mobility Report did is took this 30-year-old data that applies to high-mileage GM cars with carburetors, which essentially no cars have today, unless they're electric, let's say, or I'd say even electric cars. We have electric cars now. We don't have any cars that they're built today with carburetors. The fuel economy estimate that they assumed said the faster you go, the higher your fuel economy. And they assumed that without limitation, so that if you increased your speed from 50 to 60 miles an hour, it would increase your fuel economy 70 to 80 and so on. And the converse was true. Any slowdown in speed, according to the model they use, produced higher fuel consumption. Well, we just know that's not true. When you look at the data that's published, and there are a number of studies, this is the study that was done in 1981, and it said when you're driving less than 35 miles an hour, the slower you go, there's a fuel economy penalty. But the Department of Energy's estimate, which is sort of the contour of the outside there, says, yeah, at really slow speeds, there is a fuel economy penalty. But basically, between about 30 miles an hour and about 50 miles an hour, there's very little impact of traffic speed, vehicle speed, on fuel economy. And then over 50 miles an hour, there's actually a fuel economy penalty. But the model that the Urban Mobility Report uses is based on this straight line relationship. So that as traffic slows down from 55 to 50 to 45, they assume that fuel economy deteriorates, that cars consume more energy. And that's just clearly not supportable by the evidence. Now, in the past, as I said, they had a footnote in their study that cited this study by Rao in 1981. The only change that I can see in the current report is they deleted the reference. And they have not explained in the new report how they've generated the fuel economy estimates. And we're looking forward to that. So in our minds, the flaws with this system, the data that it relies on, its reliance on this flawed concept of the travel time index, and clearly some concerns about the underlying data that support this fuel economy calculation, means that we really ought to have a better set of measures of the function and performance of our urban transportation systems. And in Driven Apart, that's what we set about to do, was to figure out, first of all, how we would correct some of the problems in the Urban Mobility Report, and then what a new set of measures might look like. And again, I don't think we've figured out necessarily what that should be. We think there ought to be a conversation, though, on both of those questions, correcting the Urban Mobility Report and then developing, in our view, accessibility-based measures. So one of the things that we did as a calculation was to go through and adjust the Urban Mobility Report data for what we thought were the problems with it. We changed the baseline to look at the level of congestion that the best cities managed to get their traffic down to, as opposed to eliminating congestion altogether. We substituted the INRIX estimates of the travel time for their model. We lowered the cost of travel time. We thought they inflated that, at least by comparison to the economic data about how travel time is valued. And then we adjusted that fuel economy model. And we found if you made those changes that you would reduce the quote-unquote cost of congestion by about 70% from the number that's claimed by the Urban Mobility Report. So we think they essentially triple what a reasonable estimate of the cost would be, and that in the last version of the report they were overstating the effect of congestion by something on the order of $49 billion a year. And then in the report, what we did is to construct a set of new indices based on accessibility, explicitly addressing this issue of how far people have to travel. And we developed an estimate based on, again, what the best-in-class cities manage to do in practice. That is, we don't think there's a way to eliminate all the distance between destinations and not travel, but clearly there are some cities, through their land use patterns, density, and the like, have shorter travel distances. So we took the 90th percentile of best practice, essentially, among large metropolitan areas in the United States, and figured out what would the performance of the transportation system look like in all the other metropolitan areas if they could achieve the kind of trip distances that we find, again, in the real world in the 90th percentile. And again, this is where we came up with this chart, and essentially that's how we got this computation. That additional distance that people travel, those shaded tips on each of those bars, That's the additional time people spend traveling in each of those metropolitan areas because their average trip length is longer than in the 10% of the best performing metropolitan areas. And so collectively, if you could get all the metropolitan areas to where the best performing metropolitan areas are, we'd drive about 40 billion miles fewer per year. We'd use about 2 billion gallons less of fuel, and we'd save something on the order of $30 billion a year. So that suggests, I think, a very different view of the payoffs and the opportunities for changing urban transportation systems than you get from the Urban Mobility Report. Now, the other interesting thing here is when you look at the Urban Mobility Report, and particularly their data over this almost 30-year period now, there's one continuous conclusion, which is every year congestion is getting worse. There's a slight dip for the last 2 years because of the recession. But the historic argument is in every single city, congestion is worse now than it was 10 and 20 and 30 years ago. That's a very discouraging sign. It means everything that we've done in transportation hasn't worked, right? But in fact, that's misleading because in some cities, there have been changes and there have been improvements in performance. And I'll just use the example of Portland because we're all familiar with that. In 1982, according to the Urban Mobility Report, our travel time index was 1.07. It took us 7% longer to take a typical peak hour trip than the same trip in the off-peak time. They say that that problem has essentially tripled, okay? So now we have a 29% penalty, that the average peak hour trip takes 29% longer than the same trip at the off-peak hour. Whether that number is true or not, if you look at the underlying data, what it implies is that actually we're traveling shorter distances on average now than we were in 1982. That according to the TTI numbers, we were traveling about 20 miles, almost 20 miles for each person in peak hour commuting, and it's down to about 16 miles today. And that the average amount of time that we spend traveling has actually declined by about 10 minutes. So here's a transportation system that, according to the TTI measures, has gotten worse, dramatically worse. But as exemplified by how far people travel and how long they spend traveling at the peak hour, their travel times have actually gone down, which is a hopeful sign. And that's one of the things that this Urban Mobility Report and any Urban Mobility Report or set of measures of our transportation system should do is it should reveal to us when we're making progress so that we know what works and what doesn't. And historically, this report has done nothing like that. And in our view, the current version of the report continues to be misleading. And again, I'll use Portland as an example and compare it to Nashville. And again, the Urban Mobility Report says that the travel time index, this is the 2010 report now, says that our travel time index is 1.23, which is much worse than Nashville. Our penalty is 23%, theirs is 15%. But then when you look at how far people travel and how long they spend traveling, the average resident of Nashville spends more than 70 hours more, about 75 hours more per year in peak hour travel, again, because it's a much more sprawling development pattern and longer trips. And congestion delays are almost identical in the two cities. So if you look at the travel time index, you get a very different picture of which place has a better performing transportation system than if you look at this total travel time measure. So ultimately, I think the Urban Mobility Report fails the critical tests of scholarship. This is put out by Texas Transportation Institute, which is an arm of Texas A&M University, the number of engineers that work on it. It's supported by the federal government, number of organizations. And I think it ought to meet a higher standard if it's going to be used and widely cited as evidence about how well our transportation systems are working. And I don't think it meets any of these 5 tests. I don't think it's theoretically sound because the travel time index completely conceals the critical role that distances play in shaping travel time. Second, the data that underlie the report are not transparent and it's not clear that it's replicable. I can speak to that particularly for the previous edition of the report. We're trying to understand how their estimates of the travel time index differ so widely from the same estimates made by INRIX. The third thing is it ought to fix errors. And in our view, relying on a 30-year-old study of fuel economy that only applied to vehicles traveling at 35 miles an hour and less is an error and should be fixed. And our concern is that they haven't even acknowledged that that error exists. The fourth thing is that regardless of your methodology, you ought to be able to corroborate your core finding with some other source of data. And they've built a model which purports to show that congestion has gotten dramatically worse. That's fine, but they ought to be able to take independent sources of data and generate evidence that supports that conclusion. And as I showed you, the data from the National Household Travel Surveys completely contradict that conclusion. They essentially show that there's been no penalty for longer speed. And then finally, in an academic world, I don't ultimately necessarily believe that we will persuade the authors of the Urban Mobility Report to change their report. But I do think we can have a good debate about this. And I think the debate will be informative, and it will help people, third parties, policymakers, and others reach better conclusions. And one of the things, very much to my chagrin, is that the authors of this report didn't even acknowledge that we had published our criticism 4 months ago. They're certainly entitled to dispute what we said. We're happy to have that discussion with them. But if you're really going to meet the tests of scholarship, you ought to do those 5 things that we don't think that they have. So ultimately, what we want to do is catalyze a discussion that produces a better measure, or if you will, better set of measures of urban transportation performance. And we think that a better set of measures would have these characteristics. That they would talk about accessibility, that is how close people are to destinations. And if you've heard a previous presentation, we've done a lot of work with a tool called Walk Score, which measures walkability, which is an accessibility-based measure that really tells us about how close people are to destinations and how that influences travel behavior. We think we ought to explicitly add to any measure of urban transportation systems measures of land use patterns and average trip distances. We should incorporate better data, and clearly the adoption of the INRIX data we think is a step in the right direction. I'm very pleased that the folks in Texas have done that. I think that's a good tool that we should all be using in a very transparent way. I think we need to open this up to be a multidisciplinary process. This is not a technical issue that can be solved by a monograph, if you will. I think this has to be very much an open and academic discussion that's informed by a variety of different points of views. And so far, what's in the Urban Mobility Report doesn't fit that guide. Now, arguably, ours is a monograph as well, but we hope that there'll be some sort of a dialectic process here that produces something ultimately that's better. And then finally, the Urban Mobility Report and transportation system measures should be about generating light. That is, shedding light on the nature of problems and what can be done to solve them. And the way that report is structured right now, it's only there to generate heat. And in our view, that's not a productive contribution to the discussion of urban transportation problems. So with that, I'll conclude. I'm not going to reiterate that. We've said all that. I'll leave it up on the screen. Happy to answer any questions that you have.
Excellent. And I'm going to remind everyone to use the microphone, or if you don't have one, or if it doesn't work, I'll come around with this portable one. So raise your hand. I'll let Joe to pick questions.
We have one right here.
So did your report look at the sustainable measures that some of those cities have taken to actually reduce the travel time?
No, our report really is just looked at performance measures, or if you will, end state measures. We didn't sort of go up the value chain or the policy chain to say what is it that we think influences that. Now, obviously, we're familiar with Portland, and we have some good ideas about what the things are that go on in Portland. Having the urban growth boundary, having made investments in the transportation system, developed alternatives like cycling and walking, having lots of neighborhoods with high walk scores. And interestingly, we think an overlooked variable is economic segregation, or put differently, economic integration. We know that part of the reason why destinations are so spread out in some metropolitan areas is because, crudely put, all the rich people live in one part of the region, all the poor people live in another part of the region. Or there are whole parts of the region that are zoned in such a way that there are no apartments, there are no low and moderate income housing, which that by itself increases average trip distances. But clearly there are a whole set of policies out there that influence trip distances, and we're just looking at the end result, not necessarily what we think all the policy levers are to influence that.
Two things. You mentioned walkability.
Yeah.
But there's been a substantial amount of research for some time attempting to develop accessibility-based measures to study transport system performance. So what do you think about the broader literature that's been developing for some time about accessibility measures? And then a more general question, the strategy you're putting out to think about these sorts of issues in policy terms is very similar to a discussion that's going on in healthcare, that there are tremendous variations in the cost of providing care across the country, and if we could only get everybody to deliver health care, say the way they do it in Minneapolis, which is one of the low-cost locations, we would save an awful lot of money. And you're proposing something similar to that. Let's look at the best cases, and if we could only get every place to move in that direction, we would do a lot better. So what do you think about the political aspects of trying to implement such a policy?
Well, first of all, I think there is an expanding literature on accessibility measures. I think that the challenge is, with the exception, and WalkScore is really an exception to this, they haven't been popularized. I mean, you and I and academics can do a good job of building an accessibility measure, but then how do we translate it into terms that can be understood by people and used by policymakers? And I think that's a big part of where the challenge is. And to get to talk about this, again, we've used the focus on trip distances and to talk about land use patterns as they relate to transportation. So I think there's a lot of work to be done in that area, and I'm hopeful that we'll help build a case for that. And I think it is a good analogy to healthcare, and part of the problem is, as in healthcare, we have great measures of process and investments, and not necessarily really good measures of results. And I think that's the lesson here: is we have to know what we're trying to optimize in the system. And essentially, if you use the travel time index as the thing that you're trying to optimize, you end up chasing your tail, because we know that investments in transportation tend to produce longer trip lengths over time, and that just means that we'll spend longer and longer in travel. So in our view, getting the definition of what is a good performing system correct is essential to getting agreement on the policy issues. But it doesn't automatically cause it to happen. We got a question here. I think the microphone's not working.
And then the gentleman next to you.
Thank you. You bring several technical issues that I need to do further study to even ask you. You're probably right in many of them, because the TTI report that started 1982 and methodology have changed. But on the principle, I have a challenge for you, at least because my first traffic engineering professor was a trained PhD from Texas A&M. We transportation planners, at least at the time I got my training many years ago, we are different in the United States than at the time we said Soviet Union. We do not dictate planning. We plan for what is there. And we are not policymakers. The politicians make the decisions. And so people live where they live, and we provide the transportation. So that is the principle of why we do capacity analysis. If I can extend your point, I would say, why let's assume that nobody should be in the cars unless everybody use public transportation. That's not too much of a difference than somebody traveling a short distance or a long distance. Thank you.
Well, I think there's a fiction that somehow transportation investments are purely technocratic and it's simply following consumer demand. But I think the evidence is abundantly clear, particularly in the long term, that consumer demand responds to the investments that we make in the transportation system. And I think that's one of the characteristics here. When you look at that set of cities, the cities that have the longest trip lengths are the ones that have had the most growth in the last 2 or 3 decades, the Birminghams, the Oklahoma cities and others, and have developed at a much lower density, and in part because of the transportation system and the street grid system and everything else that they've developed. So I think our point is those two things are interlinked. And I guess the other thing I would say is, and it comes back to this point of economic integration, a big piece of this has to do with personal choices that people make. But they make them within the context of public policy and the set of incentives that are available to them. So public policy sets the table, and then individuals make choices. And I think we shouldn't just assume that transportation is just solely responding to demand. It's creating a set of choices. And we should be explicit about how we gauge that range of choices. Yeah.
I was wondering if you'd had any conversations with the people from the Texas Institute about your study, and then also what criticisms you've received from your study since it came out.
We had a couple of short conversations. We sent them a copy of the report shortly in advance of its publication, and they've responded a couple of times in the press, but nothing direct to us. And as I said, the new version of the report doesn't even acknowledge our report. So they haven't issued any kind of a formal rebuttal to our report, though, so to answer it. I think I'm probably not the best person to characterize the comments that they have made. As I alluded to, I mean, they said that we are coming from an advocacy position. I hope that, and I'm certainly happy and have made our paper available to us, please take a look at the work that we've done. We invite comment and criticism on it. And I think we come at this not because we had a preconceived view, but because we took a look at the urban mobility report and had some concerns about it. I guess the other thing that they've said is, and I think this is an important concession in a way, is that they've sort of made a secondary argument. Yeah, well, this total travel time issue, there may be some validity to it, but people are substituting travel for expenditures on housing. And if they don't travel as far, then they're going to have to spend more money on housing. That's essentially the argument they made. That people were doing what a few years ago in the real estate community was called drive till you qualify. And so if we don't do things to invest in transportation, then people will have to spend, if they want shorter trips, they have to spend more money on housing. And I think that's a legitimate observation. But then it comes down to how much do we want to subsidize people's choice to substitute transportation for housing? And is that a socially meritorious thing that we ought to be doing? But beyond that, we have not had the kind of detailed conversation that I would just really love to have. Yeah.
So, I'll go next.
Okay.
We have a few questions that came in on the web, none
Great.
from Tim Lomax
No?
from TTI, but several asking, so how is transit incorporated in both TTI and what you've done, and maybe specifically in the case of Portland, does transit, what role does it play in the results?
And again, and I want to acknowledge this because they did a good job. The TTI published their metropolitan level summaries of how they computed the travel time index, the number of hours, and so on. And we verified that, our analysis of that with them. But they kind of back transit out of the aggregate numbers rather than build up from direct observations of transit. So what they've done is essentially computed operational gains from transit ridership and traffic management measures, and sort of backed that out of the aggregate numbers. So it's very much folded into an aggregate here and not decomposed in a way that allows us to make really strong statements about that.
So one thing I think is amazing about the TTI study is how prevalent it is, and it is like the authority, for a lot of different organizations. So I guess I'm curious if maybe there's any lessons learned from from that standpoint as to how you can get your study as prevalent as theirs. So what, beyond just these Friday seminars, and ideally will become, you know, sort of your mini ambassadors on this study, but beyond this, how do you expect to be able to make your study as prevalent as theirs?
Well, you know, this is a story that, I mean, the great thing is there are traffic reporters at basically every television station and every newspaper in the country. You know? Joe Rose at the Oregonian has a blog called Hard Drive, right? I mean, so it's a story that it's a study that essentially it writes its own story, and you know we put out our report in September. We put out our response to this about a half hour after the report came out. So we're doing everything we can to kind of get our story out. But I think part of it is, again, in our view, is constructing a better set of measures and accessibility measures. I really like Walk Score because I think it's intuitive and universally accessible, and people can see how it plays out in their community and for their house and so on. And I'm hopeful that we can use things like Walk Score to sort of change or at least add to the set of measures that we use for urban mobility. But it's a big challenge, and frankly, it's beyond an economist. I mean, we can do the number crunching, but part of it is how you weave this into a story that you tell about how cities work. And I'm hopeful that a lot of you here in the audience can help with that. Yes?
Well, I have a few points that I'd like to make. First, I definitely appreciate the analysis you've done with the Urban Mobility Report. I'm personally I was always very skeptical of it, and it's good to see that someone has sort of done a little bit of deconstruction. In general, in terms of statistical mechanics, I'm always deeply suspicious of anything that uses aggregate measures and tries to create indices out of it, because it's just inviting all sorts of biases, aggregation biases, and ecological fallacies and the like. But the other point I wanted to make, and I do not dispute, any of the stuff you reported in terms of your critiques of the UMR, but in terms of what you did present as an alternative view, I think there are a couple of things that I would suggest to make it a little bit more complete. One thing would be to consider not just, peak period travel, but also off-peak. Mm-hmm. An awful lot of these places, it's not just peak travel, but in many of our big urban areas, Chicago, Los Angeles, New York, etc., and even, smaller places, a lot of the demand gets shifted to the off-peak. And so it's not just, a peak hour.
Fair enough.
In many cases, it's not even a peak 2 hours. It's a peak, 4 hours. And so what you see is, people have travel time budgets, and they will adjust their schedules accordingly, leave a little later, leave a little earlier, make adjustments with their employers. And so an awful lot of the demand that we see in these larger areas isn't happening during the peak. A lot of it's happening outside the peak hour. Mm-hmm. So I think that needs to be part of it. And the other part of it is in terms of being more multimodal, okay? And so we often say we should be more multimodal in terms of accessibility. And I think accessibility is a good thing to look at. But if you look at sort of, the TTI report, they get their data from Highway Performance Monitoring System, so that relies on DOTs to report, highway performance mm-hmm. accurately. And of course, every DOT across the country is doing things a little bit differently. Yep. And so we need, probably better data sources, including this INRIX one, which might be good. But then where do we get data, on transit travel times? Because, the travel time in Chicago, for example, on the highways, or the roadway system, even if it's shorter, okay, if you're just looking at the auto travel time, that's one thing. But we also have to take into account that in Chicago, say a 7-mile trip on the L, on the CTA, takes some amount of time too. And so I think coming up with sort of a weighted travel time that's based on all the different modes really needs to be part of the analysis as well.
Yeah, those are all good observations, and I think you're absolutely right. And we're working at the 50,000 foot level, and these aggregate measures, I agree with you, they're incomplete. They're subject to bias. That's one of the concerns that we have. And they need to be supplemented with the sort of things that you can bring it to ground and take a broader view, as you've said. So I'm in agreement. Greg.
I have a somewhat related question about the travel times that you came up with, or that you have the the big chart for different cities. And as a recent exile from Chicago, I was shocked to find that Chicago is at the bottom of the list in terms of the number of minutes that people spend in traffic. But I started thinking about how the average number, if it's only picking up commuters, how that's influenced by, for example, the availability of commuter rail that may influence, so you may be biasing who's actually picked up in that auto commuter sample. It may be people who are commuting suburb to suburb or within the city or other places that are not available, where they don't have an option to hop on rail, and so they're not people with these longer suburb CBD commutes are not in that measure. I mean, I don't know if that's, I guess my question has to do with how that average number is constructed and how that might be compositionally different across different cities.
Yeah, it's, the earlier comment, I think, raises the point. It's constructed from aggregate data rather than from microdata. So we know total number of commuters, we know total number of miles traveled, we have some idea of how fast people are moving, and that's the database aggregated across metropolitan areas that we're producing. But somewhere buried within that are those compositional effects that you speak to. So, and again, the approach that we use, and actually I should have mentioned this because it's relevant to you all, is Alec Bagassi and Rob Bertini did sort of a preliminary reconstruction or deconstruction and reconstruction of the underlying TTI data that we essentially used as our kind of the basis for doing our computation. So again, we're working with aggregate data that has some limitations, and I don't always trust it exactly. But again, the computations that I've given you are essentially exactly consistent with the underlying data, and for good and bad, that goes into the TTI report.
So Michelle is going to have the last question.
Okay.
Similar to Christy's question, how do you see or hope this report influences not only transportation policy but land use policy?
Well, I hope it's a bridge between the two. It says that the decisions that we make with land use policy have a huge amount to do with how well our transportation system functions, and the notion that that you can't consider that you can get away with considering the two separately, in my mind, is wrong, particularly at the metropolitan level. We need to be thinking about how those things interact. And I think the place that they come together in a technical sense is thinking about it in terms of accessibility rather than thinking about travel. And from an economist perspective, travel is a transaction cost. Some people, we joyride sometimes. We travel a long distance for the joy of being, say, in a car or on a bicycle, and we derive utility from travel sometimes. But most of the time, we travel to reach a destination, to be to another place, to engage in activity, to consume something, to have an interaction. And the fundamental problem, in my view, with the TTI approach, the travel time index, is it optimizes traveling as opposed to optimizing the set of functions, utilities, activities that transportation is supposed to support. And that's the piece that we need to focus on. And that hopefully takes us straight to land use.
Before we thank our speaker, I need to put a little plug in for next week. We actually have some visitor from Shanghai, Professor Chen from Tongji University, and she'll be talking about transportation in Shanghai, specifically in relationship to the World's Fair. So I hope we'll see some of you next week. Thank you very much, Joe.